It began with a child, barefoot in the snow. The year was 1868, in a forgotten corner of Ohio, when the boy stumbled into town under the pale light of dawn, silent, shivering, and wrong. His skin was so white it nearly glowed, his lips colorless, his pulse steady but cold. When the doctor pressed the blade against his finger, what dripped out wasn't blood. It was clear, like water. No red, no life. Yet somehow he lived. They thought it was frostbite, a sickness, something medical. But what they found instead, hidden deep in those woods, was a family untouched by warmth, untouched by time, and untouched by blood. The snowstorm that swept across Ohio in the winter of 1868 was unlike anything the small town of Coldwater had ever endured. The wind howled like a dying animal, carrying with it sheets of ice that buried roads, fences, and even the outlines of homes. Most families sealed themselves inside, burning the last of their firewood and praying that the blizzard would pass. But at the edge of the town, just as dawn began to cut through the storm's last gasp, a figure appeared in the whiteness, small, stumbling, and barefoot. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, his nightshirt torn at the sleeves, his skin so pale it nearly blended into the snow around him. His lips trembled, not from cold, but from something deeper, as if his body no longer understood warmth at all. When he collapsed by the main road, it was the town's young physician, Dr. Emmett Rowan, who spotted him first. The doctor had been searching for a lost patient in the storm, but what he found instead was something he couldn't explain. He lifted the child into his arms and was struck by the unnatural chill of his skin. It wasn't the normal cold of frostbite. It was the deep, steady cold of something that didn't belong to the living. The boy's eyes fluttered open for a moment, pupils wide and glassy, and he whispered a single word that sounded like, "Home." Dr. Rowan hurried him to his clinic, where the small fire did little to raise the boy's temperature. He ordered warm blankets, hot water, and began examining him, assuming he was suffering from exposure. But the boy's heartbeat was strong, too strong for someone half frozen. When the doctor pressed a finger to his wrist, the pulse was steady and wrong. It throbbed slowly, as though his blood moved reluctantly through his veins. When Rowan pricked the boy's finger with a sterilized lancet to check circulation, he expected a bead of red to bloom against the pale skin. Instead, what emerged made him step back. A single droplet of translucent liquid welled up where blood should have been. It wasn't thick, wasn't red, and carried no scent of iron. It was clear, almost crystalline under the lamplight. He pressed harder, and more of the strange substance pooled, gliding down the boy's hand like water. It left no stain, no trace. Rowan's assistant gasped, crossing himself in horror, but the doctor remained frozen, unable to speak. The child didn't cry or flinch. He only watched the doctor with a vacant calmness, as though he'd seen this reaction before. Rowan quickly wrapped the wound, though there was no real bleeding to stop, and noticed the boy's breath fogging the air in steady, mechanical rhythm. When the doctor leaned close to listen to his chest, he heard a faint hum beneath the heartbeat, something almost electrical, like the whine of wind against metal. As word spread, townspeople gathered outside the clinic, whispering tales of ghosts and changelings, saying the storm had brought something unnatural from the woods. The sheriff insisted it was just a sick child from one of the farms. But when Rowan cleaned the frost from the boy's feet, he found no cuts, no swelling, not even redness from the freezing snow, only smooth, colorless skin, unmarred by the cold. The boy never answered when asked his name. The only time he spoke, he repeated the same word again, home. That night, as the storm quieted and the moon rose like a ghost over the horizon, Rowan stepped out onto the porch and saw small, faint footprints leading back into the trees. He hadn't noticed them before. Shallow impressions that glistened under the moonlight, as though wet, yet never melting the snow beneath. It was then he realized the child hadn't escaped something in the forest. He had come from it. When the storm finally cleared, Dr. Emmett Rowan decided to follow the trail of faint footprints leading into the woods. The child had remained silent for 2 days, sitting upright in the clinic bed, eyes unfocused yet alert, refusing food and reacting to no sound or light. The sheriff, though skeptical, joined the doctor on the third morning. Both men wrapped in heavy coats as they stepped into the pale stillness beyond the town's edge. The woods of Coldwater were dense and quiet, their branches bowed under the weight of snow, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. For nearly an hour they followed the faint trail until it vanished at a clearing. There, half hidden by frost and distance, stood a house that didn't look abandoned but didn't look alive either. The boards were pale as bone, the roof sagged with ice, and a single wisp of smoke curled weakly from the chimney. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by time, as if it had been standing there before the town was ever built. The boy, when carried along the path by the doctor, stirred faintly and whispered that single word again. Home. The men approached cautiously. When Rowan knocked on the front door, the sound echoed strangely, as though the wood were hollow. Moments later the door creaked open, and standing there was a woman whose face looked carved from wax. Her hair was silver white, though she couldn't have been more than 30. Her eyes were a light gray, almost translucent, and she stared at the boy without a flicker of surprise or relief. Instead, she simply said, "You brought him back." The tone wasn't thankful. It was final, as if a long-standing order had just been fulfilled. Behind her, faint shadows moved in the dim light of the house. Tall figures, silent and slow, each watching with that same empty expression. Rowan introduced himself and began explaining how he'd found the boy, but the woman's eyes never left her child. "He shouldn't have left the woods," she said quietly, before beckoning them inside. The interior of the house was colder than the outside. The fireplace was burning, yet the warmth never spread. The furniture was bare of color, stripped of varnish or fabric, and on the walls hung portraits of the family, though every face looked eerily similar, as if copied from one another. The sheriff, uneasy, asked for their family name. "Fitzgerald," the woman replied, her voice barely rising. Rowan tried to examine the boy once more, but the woman's hand stopped him, cool and firm against his wrist. "He's not sick," she said. "He just wandered too far from the frost." It was an odd phrase, but the way she said it, quiet and deliberate, made the doctor's throat go dry. As Rowan's eyes adjusted, he noticed details that unsettled him. The absence of color in their skin, the faint blue shimmer that ran beneath it like veins filled with ice instead of blood, the strange rhythm of their movements as if their bodies obeyed a different kind of heartbeat. There were 5 of them in total. The mother, the father who stood silently by the hearth, 2 daughters seated near the window, and the boy. None of them blinked often, none of them shivered. The father finally spoke, his voice deep and distant, saying that their family had lived in those woods long before the township was founded. When the sheriff questioned why no one in town had heard of them, the man simply said, "Because the town forgot." Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, and when Rowan glanced through the window, he saw the frost spreading thickly across the glass from the inside out. The doctor, sensing the heavy air pressing on his chest, tried to excuse himself, but the mother smiled faintly, her lips pale and cracked. "Thank you for bringing our son back," she said again, though now her words sounded like both gratitude and warning. As Rowan and the sheriff stepped back into the woods, neither spoke until they reached the edge of town. The doctor swore the cold on his skin didn't fade for hours, and that night he couldn't shake the image of the family's eyes, gray and endless like the frozen lake near their home, watching him as if they were waiting for the next one of them to wander too far from the frost. Dr. Emmett Rowan could not stop thinking about the Fitzgerald family after returning to town. Every rational part of his mind told him to dismiss what he had seen, the colorless skin, the cold breath, the lifeless calm in their voices. But a part of him refused to believe it was simply a trick of the cold. He convinced himself that there had to be a medical explanation, something rare but natural. In the days that followed, he gathered notes from his brief examination of the boy, carefully documenting every odd detail. The pulse had been slower than average, yet steady. The temperature of the skin was several degrees below normal, yet the child showed no sign of illness. The clear fluid that replaced blood fascinated and disturbed him equally. He was certain that if he could understand it, he would uncover a discovery beyond anything in medical science. So, ignoring the unease that followed him since that day in the woods, Rowan prepared his instruments and returned to the Fitzgerald home under the guise of offering a checkup for the boy's recovery. When he arrived, the family greeted him with the same quiet courtesy, though their stillness unsettled him more this time. The boy sat at the table, unblinking, his hands folded neatly, his eyes pale and distant. Rowan tried to speak casually, asking if the boy had eaten or slept. The mother answered softly that he needed neither, which made Rowan's hand freeze on his satchel. He asked for permission to perform a few harmless tests, and the father, after a long silence, nodded once. The doctor retrieved his stethoscope and thermometer, pretending confidence though his hands trembled slightly. When he listened to the boy's chest, he heard something faintly rhythmic, but it didn't sound like the familiar thump of a human heart. It was slower, deeper, and seemed to echo as if reverberating through hollow space. When he placed the thermometer under the boy's tongue, the mercury refused to rise past 70 degrees. He replaced it 3 times, even tried a different one, yet the result remained unchanged. Determined to verify what he had witnessed earlier, Rowan produced a small needle and gently pricked the boy's fingertip once more. Again, that same colorless liquid oozed from the skin, clear as water, thick as oil. This time he caught a drop of it in a glass vial, sealing it tightly. The mother watched, her eyes expressionless, and said nothing. Rowan tried to reassure her that it was for medical study only, but she simply turned her gaze toward the window, where frost had begun to spread across the glass again despite the fire still burning behind them. The doctor finished his notes quickly, thanked the family, and left before nightfall. He could feel their eyes following him as he disappeared into the trees. Back in his clinic, he placed the vial under lamplight and examined it. The liquid shimmered faintly, refracting light in shifting patterns, almost alive. When he tried to warm it slightly over the flame, it turned opaque, then vanished into a thin vapor that smelled faintly of iron and salt. There was no residue left, no trace of moisture, as though it had never existed. He repeated the process twice more, using every scientific method he knew, but the result was always the same. The substance could not be preserved, could not be measured, and seemed to resist examination entirely. He began to wonder whether it was even a form of blood at all. The next evening, the sheriff came by to check on him and found the doctor pale, sitting before the empty vial. Rowan confessed what he had seen, and though the sheriff dismissed it as hysteria from overwork, he couldn't hide his own unease. That night, Rowan wrote a letter to the state medical board, describing what he believed to be a new genetic anomaly, a family whose bodies lacked hemoglobin but somehow sustained life through another means. Yet, as he wrote, he could not shake the memory of the father's voice, low and deliberate, saying their kind had lived long before the township. For the first time in his career, the doctor began to fear that science might not be enough to explain what he had brought back from those woods. The well stood behind the Fitzgerald farmhouse, half buried under the snow, its wooden cover warped and gray with age. Dr. Rowan first noticed it during his second visit when the frost began to recede just enough to expose the circular stones around its rim. The sight of it stirred a strange unease in him, though he couldn't explain why. It looked older than the house itself, as if the family had built their home around it rather than beside it. When he asked about it casually, the father only replied that it was better left sealed. But something about the way his voice tightened at those words told Rowan there was more to the story. That evening, he mentioned the well to a few of the townsfolk at the inn, and their reaction was immediate. The chatter died, spoons halted halfway to mouths, and the innkeeper himself crossed himself before saying that the well behind the Fitzgerald land was supposed to have been sealed by the town elders decades ago. When Rowan pressed for why, no one gave a straight answer. They spoke in fragments, about noises in the night, about livestock found drained, about something that crawled up from the bottom during one bitter winter and never went back down. The doctor tried to reason with them, saying it was likely an old mining shaft or a spring that had dried. But the fear in their eyes wasn't superstition. It was memory. One of the oldest men in town, a half-blind farmer named Silas Crane, told him that when he was a boy, his father had helped seal that well after 3 men vanished while trying to clean it. The story went that the men had been lowering buckets into the darkness when the rope snapped, and one by one they went down to recover it, but none came back up. The next morning the well was covered in frost, though it hadn't been cold enough to freeze. That same night the Fitzgerald land had gone dark. No lamps, no voices, only the creaking of the wind. The next day, when the townsfolk returned, they found the Fitzgeralds alive and well, claiming to have heard nothing. Silas swore that was the last time anyone had seen the well open until now. That story sank into Rowan's thoughts like a thorn. He couldn't reconcile the eerie legend with his belief in science, yet the sense of unease refused to leave him. He returned to the Fitzgerald property the next afternoon under the pretense of checking the boy's progress, but detoured toward the back of the house. The snow crunched softly underfoot as he approached the well, now fully visible under the weak sun. Its lid had been reinforced with rusted nails and strips of iron, but cracks ran through the boards, thin enough to let a faint draft escape. He knelt down and pressed his ear against it. At first there was only silence, then, faintly, a low hum, like a breath drawn through the hollow of a bone. It wasn't wind. It had rhythm, a pulse, as if something deep below was alive. He jerked back, heart pounding, and for a moment thought he saw condensation forming on the wood despite the cold, as if warm air had risen from below. Before he could investigate further, the father's voice broke through the stillness behind him. "The well is not yours to open, Doctor." Rowan turned to find the man standing only a few paces away, his eyes expressionless, yet his presence suffocating. The doctor muttered an apology and backed away, but as he did, he noticed something that chilled him more than the air. The snow near the well was wet, not frozen, as though it had been recently disturbed. Drops of that same clear water-like substance glistened on the stones, trailing from the edge toward the trees. That night Rowan couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined that sound, that low, steady hum from the depths, and the thought that maybe the family or strange blood wasn't something they were born with, but something they were given, drawn from whatever lay beneath that sealed circle of stone, waiting for someone foolish enough to open it again. The following Sunday, the church bells of Coldwater rang through the biting wind, their sound thin and trembling as if the metal itself resisted being heard. Dr. Rowan, exhausted and restless, attended the service hoping for distraction, but he couldn't escape the Fitzgeralds from his mind. The clear blood, the sound from the well, the frost that seemed to bloom wherever they lingered, all of it defied reason. After the sermon, he approached Pastor Samuel Greaves, an old man with trembling hands and eyes that carried the weight of something unsaid. When Rowan mentioned the Fitzgeralds' name, the pastor froze as though struck. For a long moment he didn't respond, then finally asked if Rowan had been to their home. When the doctor nodded, the pastor sighed deeply and motioned for him to follow into the empty vestry, where the light was dim and the air still smelled faintly of candle smoke. There, the pastor spoke in a tone that mixed pity and dread. "You think what you found is a miracle of science, Doctor," he said, "but some things were never meant to be explained by man." He began to tell a story that few in town remembered, and fewer still dared to repeat. Long before Coldwater was founded, when the land was nothing but woods and frost, settlers had arrived during a brutal winter that starved them to desperation. Food was gone, sickness spread, and death visited their camp nightly. Among those settlers was a man named Elias Fitzgerald, the family's ancestor. According to the pastor's records, Elias had been a devout but desperate man, the kind who believed faith could bend even death. When his youngest child died of fever, Elias vanished into the woods for 3 nights, returning only when the snow had turned black from ash. He claimed he had found something beneath the frozen ground, a voice that spoke through the cold, offering life in exchange for devotion. The next morning, his dead daughter walked again, pale and silent, with eyes that no longer held the light of a child. The other settlers fled, but the Fitzgeralds stayed, building their home near the place Elias had called the Frost's Mouth, which the pastor believed to be the same well behind their farmhouse. The pastor's hands shook as he produced an old ledger, its pages brittle with age, showing faded ink that described baptisms, deaths, and strange omissions. He pointed to several entries where the Fitzgerald name appeared without burial dates, and beneath them a note written by one of his predecessors: "Their blood does not belong to man." He explained that the town elders had once tried to burn the house down, but every flame died in the cold before it could touch the walls. They sealed the well, built the church, and swore never to speak of the family again, believing silence was the only way to keep the curse asleep. But now, with the boy's return to town, the pastor feared that seal had been broken. He told Rowan that some people are not cursed by the devil, but by what lives beneath the world, things that feed on warmth and replace it with stillness, things that can make the body live without blood, but at a terrible price. Rowan tried to argue that the story was just a myth, a fabrication born from fear and faith colliding. But the pastor only looked at him with hollow eyes and said, "If you look into their eyes long enough, you'll see it too. There's no reflection in them, no soul, just frost." As Rowan left the church, the air outside felt heavier, the cold sharper than before. The snowflakes that landed on his coat didn't melt. They clung to the fabric, perfectly formed, as if even the air had turned against warmth. He thought about the boy's clear blood, about how it had turned to vapor under light, and for the first time the doctor wondered if he had mistaken a medical mystery for a warning. One written not in scripture or science, but in the breath of something ancient that still whispered beneath the frozen earth, answering prayers that should never have been spoken. The first sighting happened a week after the pastor's warning. The blizzard had passed, leaving the fields silent under a glassy crust of ice, when a group of townsfolk returning from the mill claimed they had seen figures by the frozen lake. It was near midnight, and the moon hung low and white, casting long shadows across the snow. At first they thought it was a trick of the light, 6 or 7 people standing motionless on the far side of the lake, their reflections faintly distorted beneath the ice. But then one of the witnesses swore they saw the figures move, gliding rather than walking, until they reached the center of the frozen water. The next morning the sheriff found faint impressions in the snow where the figures had stood, long and narrow, spaced too evenly to belong to ordinary footsteps. The town whispered of ghosts, but Dr. Rowan knew exactly who it was: the Fitzgeralds. Every account described their height, their colorless clothing, the way they didn't sink into the snow. He tried to dismiss it, but the image haunted him, the thought of those pale forms gathered on the ice, waiting for something beneath it to stir. 3 nights later, he saw it himself. Unable to resist his growing obsession, Rowan walked out toward the lake, lantern in hand, breath fogging in the brittle air. The forest was quiet, so quiet it felt like the world had stopped breathing. When he reached the tree line, he saw them. The Fitzgerald family stood in a perfect circle on the frozen lake, their heads bowed, hands clasped loosely at their sides. The moonlight gave their skin a faint glow, like marble under glass. For a long time they didn't move, and the doctor thought perhaps they were praying. Then the sound came, a deep crack, the ice shifting beneath them, but none of them reacted. Instead, they stepped forward in unison, until the ice gave way. One by one, they sank beneath the surface, the water closing silently over their heads. Rowan's heart hammered against his ribs as he ran toward the lake's edge, the lantern swinging wildly. When he reached it, the water was perfectly still. No bubbles, no struggle, only his own reflection trembling in the black mirror of the ice. He waited for minutes, maybe hours. He couldn't tell. The cold dulled his sense of time. Then, without warning, the surface rippled and the figures began to re-emerge. They rose as if lifted, faces breaking through the ice without effort. Their hair plastered against their skin, but their expressions calm, almost serene. Not a shiver ran through them. Their eyes were open, unblinking, the pupils wide and gray. Rowan stumbled back in horror as they walked toward the shore, the ice reforming behind them with each step. He ducked behind a fallen tree, clutching the lantern to his chest, watching as they passed. The boy was among them, holding his mother's hand, his lips moving as if whispering something too soft for the wind to carry. When they disappeared into the woods, the doctor finally exhaled, his breath trembling like smoke. He returned to town before dawn, pale and shaking. But when he tried to tell the sheriff, the man only stared at him with disbelief. "People don't walk through ice, Emmett. he said. But Rowan knew what he had seen. That morning, he checked the lake again, and though the snow had fallen fresh overnight, he could still see the faint trail of wet footprints leading from the water to the woods. Not melting the snow, just resting on top of it, as if left by something weightless. The pastor's words echoed in his mind, about beings that live without warmth, creatures that do not die because they never truly live. The doctor wanted to believe there was still a scientific explanation, but the image of those figures beneath the ice shattered every law of nature he knew. They had gone willingly into the frozen depths and returned as if reborn, untouched by death, unbound by the limits of flesh. And in that moment, Dr. Rowan understood why their blood carried no red. They didn't need life the way humans did. Whatever sustained them came from beneath that ice, something older than the town, older than faith, something that had chosen the Fitzgeralds long ago and would never let them go. After witnessing the Fitzgeralds emerge unharmed from beneath the frozen lake, Dr. Rowan could no longer sleep. The image of them walking through solid ice returned to him every time he closed his eyes, and the sound of cracking frost haunted his waking hours like a whisper from the edge of reason. He began to spend his nights reading by lamplight, searching every medical journal and natural philosophy text he owned, but none offered an explanation that made sense. The word hemoglobin appeared again and again, describing the iron within human blood that gave it life and color. Without it, a body could not survive. And yet the Fitzgeralds not only survived, they defied every rule that bound ordinary life. Eventually, his curiosity grew stronger than his fear. He decided that if he could not explain them by study alone, he would have to test them again, this time in secret, away from their watchful eyes. It was a reckless decision, but he convinced himself it was for science, not obsession. On a cold night thick with fog, Rowan made his way back to the Fitzgerald farmhouse. The windows were dark, the house silent except for the creak of frozen wood. He entered through the back, carrying only his satchel, his scalpel, and a small lantern. The air inside was colder than the snow outside, heavy and unmoving, and his breath hung in front of him like smoke. He found the boy asleep on a chair by the fire, though the flames had long gone out. The child's chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm, but when Rowan pressed 2 fingers to his neck, he felt nothing. No pulse, no warmth. His hands trembled as he prepared the needle, pricking the boy's arm just above the wrist. Once again, the colorless fluid welled up, glistening faintly in the lantern's glow. He carefully drew it into a small vial, sealing it tight before setting it under the light for observation. The substance swirled lazily, shifting like mist trapped in glass. For a moment it appeared to pulse, responding to the flicker of the flame. Then the lantern dimmed and something impossible happened. The liquid began to vanish, turning to vapor that rose in thin spirals toward the ceiling. It disappeared completely, leaving the glass dry and clean. The doctor's heart raced. He checked his instruments, his hands, his coat, searching for some sign of residue, but there was nothing. Then, behind him, the floorboards creaked. He turned sharply, his lantern trembling in his grip, and saw the mother standing in the doorway. Her expression was not anger or surprise, but quiet disappointment, as though she had expected this. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly. Her voice was calm, but every word chilled the air. "It doesn't belong in the light." Rowan stammered an apology, explaining that he only wanted to understand. But she stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. "Understanding is what brings it closer," she whispered. The boy stirred then, eyes fluttering open, and for the first time, Rowan saw something flicker behind them. Not fear, not life, but reflection, like the shimmer of moonlight on ice. The father appeared next, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "Doctor," he said in that deep, steady tone, "you took something that was never yours to take." Rowan tried to back away, but the air in the room felt heavy, as if every breath turned to frost before it reached his lungs. The mother reached out and touched the doctor's arm. Her hand was impossibly cold, colder than any living skin should be, and where she touched him, the veins beneath his skin seemed to pale. "Go home," she said quietly. "Forget what you saw. Forget us." Rowan stumbled out into the snow, clutching his satchel. his breath ragged and white in the moonlight. When he looked back, the house windows glowed faintly from within, not with firelight, but with a pale, steady blue shimmer that pulsed like a heartbeat. He walked until his legs gave out, collapsing near the edge of the woods, his hand still marked where she had touched him. Under the skin, faint lines glistened, not red, but clear as glass. In that moment, he understood that the Fitzgeralds' condition was not illness or miracle. It was contagion, something that could spread, something that could change the very essence of blood. And though he made it home before sunrise, he could still feel the cold under his flesh, crawling slowly toward his heart. By the time the doctor's journal reached the sheriff's office, it was already too late. Snow had started falling heavier that week, thick and blinding, and the path leading to the Fitzgerald property disappeared beneath it. When a search party finally trudged through the woods, all they found was an empty space where the house once stood. No ashes, no foundation, no sign that a building had ever been there. The air smelled faintly metallic like rust on old water, and the only trace left behind were a series of footprints, bare, elongated wet, leading from where the house used to be all the way down to the frozen edge of Lorne Lake. The prints stopped just before the ice. No one could tell if they had gone beneath it or simply vanished. The sheriff's men tried breaking through the ice to search below, but every strike of the pickaxe only echoed hollow, as though the lake were more cavern than water. A few of them swore they heard knocking coming back from under the ice, slow and deliberate, but the others dismissed it as the wind echoing off the hills. The doctor's lantern was found near the shoreline, still burning faintly, its glass fogged from the inside with something sticky and clear. Inside the lantern, resting against the wick, was a single note in trembling handwriting that simply read, "It is not blood they took. It is what came before blood." Nobody understood what that meant. The following spring, the thaw never came to that part of the woods. While the rest of Ohio bloomed again, the Fitzgerald land stayed locked in frost. The trees there grew no leaves, and the animals refused to cross the invisible border where the family once lived. Farmers nearby said that when the wind blew from that direction, their cattle grew restless and their wells turned cloudy. Even stranger, some nights people claimed to see shapes standing on the far edge of the frozen lake, perfectly still, like a family watching from a distance. The figures would vanish when approached, leaving only puddles of clear water that steamed against the cold air. Locals eventually sealed off the area, calling it cursed, though none of them could explain what curse could freeze the earth itself. Years passed, and the story faded into a whispered warning told around winter fires. But sometimes, travelers spoke of a faint light flickering deep in the woods on moonless nights, as if someone still carried the doctor's lantern, searching. Others said they heard faint footsteps crunching across the frozen surface, circling endlessly, never growing louder or fading away. Those who went looking for proof never returned, and every time the ice was disturbed, the wind would howl through the valley in a low, hollow tone that almost sounded like breathing. By the turn of the century, the town of Lorne Hollow was gone, reclaimed by forest and snow, its last few survivors moving away after one final terrible winter where all their livestock were found drained. No blood, no struggle, just pale and stiff like porcelain statues. People who found the carcasses said they didn't rot. They just faded, skin turning translucent before crumbling to dust. Those who lived closest to the lake said that night, when they looked into the ice, they saw faces, 5 of them, staring back from beneath the surface, colorless and motionless, eyes open but empty. The Fitzgeralds had not vanished. They had returned to where they came from, beneath the frozen mirror that hid something ancient and waiting. And if you stand there today, in that same silent clearing where the house once stood, the air still feels heavier, colder, as if the ground itself remembers what human blood once looked like. Some say on the coldest nights you can hear soft knocking from beneath the lake, and if you listen too long, your reflection begins to fade. So tell me, would you dare look into the ice of Lorne Lake alone?